growing today. And the man who would be in charge of those proceedings, should they happen, isn't wasting any time. House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler just announcing he is going to court for the secret grand jury material in the Mueller report, and he'll try to enforce a subpoena for former White House counsel Don McGahn, a key witness. This message, though, from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she's not ready to call for impeachment outright. CNN's Manu Raju, in fact, asked her whether at this point she's just trying to run out the clock.
No, I'm not trying to run out the clock. Let's get sophisticated about this, okay? Okay?
But how long do you think these court fights will take?
We will proceed when we have what we need to proceed, not one day sooner. Their advocacy for impeachment only gives me leverage. I have no complaint with what they are doing. I'm willing to take whatever heat there is there to say when the decision will be made in a timely fashion. This isn't endless.
And Manu Raju joins me now. So Manu, Congress, of course, set to leave for 6 weeks of summer vacation today. What more do we know about Chairman Nadler's strategy here?
Well, a very significant development just happened moments ago when the House Judiciary Committee announced that it would move forward with a lawsuit to seek grand jury information related to the Mueller probe. But as part of this lawsuit, they're saying they need that information in order to decide whether or not to recommend articles of impeachment against the President of the United States. They cite that directly in this lawsuit that's about to be filed in federal court. And Jerry Nadler made clear that this is a step because they consider whether or not to impeach this president. The chairman of the committee has privately pushed for an impeachment inquiry for weeks, but Nancy Pelosi has not wanted to go down that route. At the moment, it appears that essentially what the committee is doing, its investigation, is essentially the same as an impeachment inquiry. Now, I asked Jerry Nadler about this. Is it the same thing? What you're doing right now to investigate the president, is it essentially the same as an impeachment inquiry? He said it essentially is, with one difference. Mr. Chairman, but you're saying there's no difference. You're saying there's no difference between what you're doing now and an impeachment inquiry, correct?
In effect, what I'm saying is that we are. Well, I suppose there is one difference which you could draw. I mean, if you said that an impeachment inquiry is when you're considering only impeachment, that's not what we're doing. We are investigating all of this, and we are going to see what remedies we could recommend, including the possibility of articles of impeachment. We're not limited to that, but that's very much the possibility as a result of what we're doing.
So he's essentially saying the outcome could be the same, recommending formal articles of impeachment, even if they're not currently in an impeachment inquiry, saying essentially the same. And an interesting point here, Erica, the Speaker's office, Speaker Pelosi's office, signed off on that language that is in the lawsuit, saying that they need this information because they have to decide whether or not to move forward on impeachment proceedings. So while she's not ready to formally open up impeachment proceedings, she's at least green-lighting that language that potentially could result in impeachment proceeding. Erica?
Oh, to be a fly on the wall for that discussion when they agreed on that. Manu, thank you.
Thank you.
Speaker Pelosi also taking care of another important task before Congress leaves for that summer hiatus, meeting face-to-face with freshman Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The two lawmakers have seemingly been feuding for weeks on a range of issues. So were they able to come together? Here's the speaker again today.
I don't think there ever was any hatchet.
Well, she called you downright disrespectful.
Well, that's we're in the political arena. Let me just say this, because I have some level of confidence and actually joy in seeing diversity in our caucus. I would never even say that it was a hatchet, but I do think that we sat down today, we had a good meeting, and the Congresswoman is a very gracious member of Congress, so we had a very positive conversation about our districts and how we represent them, our country. I've always felt, again, it's like you're in a family. In a family, you have your differences, but you're still a family.
CNN national correspondent Jason Carroll also on Capitol Hill. So apparently there was no hatchet that needed to be buried. So we got that out of the way, Jason.
Right.
Give us some more specifics, though. What are you hearing about what the two discussed?
Well, look, first of all, both you have Ocasio-Cortez and you have the Speaker both saying that things went well. I mean, so that's first off. Before this meeting even got underway, though, Erica, Ocasio-Cortez made it very clear that she had a couple of goals. First and foremost, she wanted to make sure that there was this open line of communication between her office and the Speaker's office. And given the sort of rocky history that we've seen with these two, she wanted to make sure that they were on the same page when it comes to certain issues, immigration and some other issues as well. And just a little earlier this afternoon, Ocasio-Cortez, who had been sort of dodging our cameras post-meeting, our cameras did catch up with her, and this was her take on the meeting.
As always, I think the Speaker respects, the fact that we're coming together as a party and that unity, and I'm looking forward to us getting back in September.
So we're going to have to see what happens in the future. It's unclear if these two discussed some of the rocky history that they had in the past. Pelosi, you heard her talking about family, saying it's important to have family, but families bicker. No difference in this case. Erica.
Jason Carroll joining us from Capitol Hill today. Jason, thank you. CNN political analyst Julian Zelizer is a historian and a professor at Princeton University. Great to have you with us. So there's sort of a lot to parse through here. So somewhat mixed messages, I guess to a point we could say, between what we're hearing from Chairman Nadler, what we're hearing from Speaker Pelosi. The fact, though, that as Manu pointed out, they agreed to this language, as we know, in terms of moving forward with the courts. What do you make of all of this?
Well, we've been in this state since March, really, where there are ongoing investigations. Democrats talk about the possibility of impeachment, but it's not formal impeachment proceedings. The two big differences today is, one, the use of the language, apparently with the sign-off of the Speaker's office, and two, trying to get this grand jury information and really being more aggressive about getting what is unavailable to this committee. This is still not an impeachment proceeding.
Right.
And so I think what happens over break will really be important.
It's also interesting because as we're seeing the number of Democrats, right, who are saying, yes, let's go for impeachment, as we're seeing that number grow, it's also interesting that we heard from Jackie Spear, for example, who's been, fairly outspoken when it comes to this. She said, listen, we basically have until September, and then after that, we just have to move forward. Almost throwing up her hands, it would seem. That's a far different message.
Yeah, and I think all legislators are looking at the clock, they're looking at the election season, and they're worried about these coming together. Ultimately, it's about what the Speaker does. If the Speaker comes out and formally says, we are now going to look into this investigation, it will put all those moderate members on the spot. It will put pressure on them to make a decision. Until the Speaker is there, I think you're going to be in this in-between, and it's still hard for Congressman Nadler to work without her support.
Moving into this phase, right, where now they're turning to the courts and saying, we need this information because we have to decide, right, what we're going to do. Going to the courts can have a benefit, can also drag things out, as we know. Now, in some ways, if you look at what the president has done, he successfully used the courts in many ways to sort of keep pushing oversight out of the way for him.
Yeah.
And in many ways, he's consolidating the power of the presidency. Is he at the same time, in your view, also diminishing the power of Congress and really diminishing this checks and balances system that we have?
Absolutely. That's the way it works historically. Presidents try to grab more power, they flex their muscle in new ways, and the real issue is what Congress does. If Congress doesn't respond, we usually create new precedents, and the next president is that much more powerful. That's a lot of what's at stake right now, many Democrats believe. For example, if the president can obstruct justice and Congress says we're not going to do anything about it, that becomes a new base. So we have seen an expansion of power under the president, and that's why the congressional response is what we're watching for.
I want to get your take on something else. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar writing a piece in the New York Times, her op-ed, which was titled, "It's Not Enough to Condemn Trump's Racism." She talks a little about her experience and what brought her to running for office, right, and to ultimately being elected. One of the things that stood out is she writes in part, "The beauty of this country is not that our democracy is perfect. It's that embedded in our Constitution and democratic institutions are the tools to make it better." Going on to say the proudest moments in our history, from the Emancipation Proclamation to the Civil Rights Movement to the struggle against fascism, have come when we fight to protect and expand basic democratic rights. Today, democracy is under attack once again. This would seem to be a direct rebuke, obviously, of the president, not just what he said about his racist tweets and what he's had to say about her and her faith, but also the fact that he's called her and fellow lawmakers un-American because they disagree with him, right? But there are plenty of voters who like what she's doing, who elected her to office. So just give us a sense. I mean, just remind us in history, other moments where seemingly going against the president or the government has all of a sudden made you unpatriotic.
Yeah, it is an old tactic. During the Cold War in the 1950s, this was often a tactic used against those who were pursuing anti-communists or pursuing communists. And if you criticize the technique of a Senator Joe McCarthy, he would question your Americanness. He would question your patriotism. So it's a tactic we've seen before. In the 1980s, we saw Republicans do it against Democrats who were opposing funding for anti-communist forces in Central America.
Ultimately, something changes, though. What do you think? Is there something that changes that discussion in 2019?
Well, over time, there's been more opposition to that kind of tactic. It's underhanded. It tries to squash genuine opposition. And ultimately, both parties need to understand they will be out of power, and it's important to have mechanisms that allow for opposition. And that might be protecting voting rights, but it also is the rhetoric we use and creating certain boundaries on how we talk about opponents. And that's why a lot are troubled by hearing the president go after her as un-American rather than criticizing her policies and stance.
Julian, always appreciate your insight. Thank
you.
The Commerce Department says this number is the most popular indicator of just how healthy the economy is in the U.S. And that number, the GDP, the gross domestic product, is at 2.1%, which is both good and bad news for the president. So let's get the bad news out of the way. 2.1% means the economy is growing at a slower rate than last quarter. The good news here, 2.1 is better than what many economists expected. CNN's chief business correspondent Christine Romans has a look now at just why the economy's growth took a hit.
Erica, economic growth slowed just a little bit in the second quarter, a rate of 2.1% for economic growth. You can see that's less than the prior quarter, 3.1%. Part of that reason might be because so many companies were rushing at the beginning of the year to buy the goods they would need to build their inventories, knowing that they'd be more expensive later on because of the president's trade war, because higher tariffs. And then, of course, that takes away a little bit of the business you would do in the following quarter. But something interesting here, when you look at the fourth quarter of last year, that number was revised down. Something was a little bit weaker in the economy in the fourth quarter. And last summer, on the second quarter of last year, when there was that big 4.2% growth rate that the president was so proud of, that got revised down to 3.5%. So actually, the economy last year didn't hit the president's 3% target, certainly not the 4 or 5% that he has said his supercharged economy with tax cuts and regulation rollbacks would achieve. This is looking like a stable, muddling through economy, not the supercharged gangbusters economy the president has promised.
Christine Romans, thank you. Let's turn out to the race for 2020. The CNN debate's just a few days away, and the candidates are counting down by touting their new policies and trying to sway voters. Half the field is swinging through Iowa, where the first caucuses will be held in 191 days. We're counting. Don't worry, you don't have to. The other half making appearances at the National Urban League's annual conference in Indianapolis. Senator Kamala Harris, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg are among the speakers there this morning. Harris and Buttigieg both releasing big policy plans focused on the economy today. Harris's plan includes closing the wealth gap among Black Americans by investing $60 billion in STEM education at historically Black colleges and universities. While promoting the policy, though, she was challenged on her record as a prosecutor and criticism that could surface during the debates. Here's her response.
Why do we only have to be on the outside, on bended knee or trying to break down the door? Shouldn't we also have a role on the inside where the decisions are being made in a way we can influence the change that must occur? I had the power to create one of the first reentry initiatives in the United States. I didn't have to ask anybody permission to do it because I was running the office.
Mayor Pete Buttigieg also pushing his economic plan, which includes taking aim at big tech companies for outsourcing their employees. But in a preview of what could be his debate strategy, he wasted no time going after President Trump in front of voters in Indiana.
My generation saw this country elect its first Black president and then turn around and elect a racist to the White House. And we ought to call that what it is.
For a number of candidates, next week's debates just might be their last best chance to both boost support and, most importantly, to stay in the race. CNN senior political writer and analyst Harry Enton is here. Okay, so you and Crystal Liza are out with your most recent rankings, where you're taking a look at, the chances. This is a big deal next week, especially if they want to move on. You're looking at the top 10 with the best chances of the nomination.
Correct.
Walk us through, my friend.
Yeah, so this is our bottom 5, our 6 through 10, and what we essentially see here is, Andrew Yang, who has his Yang gang, he's been able to raise a lot of money from a lot of donors, but really got in no words during the last debate. I almost forgot that he was there. We have Julian Castro, who actually did fairly well in the last debates, right? He was able to make some sort of breakthrough, get a lot of donors, raise his polling a little bit. I'm going to be very interested to see how he does on the debate stage with Joe Biden, perhaps bringing up their differences on immigration. Beto O'Rourke, though, is someone who's been plummeting down, and he's all the way down to 8th. At one point, he was at 2nd in our rankings. Amy Klobuchar, she's up 1. That's more of an indication that O'Rourke's been falling. Can she make a breakthrough with more moderate voters that Biden's been clamoring so far, holding on to? And Cory Booker holding steady at 6th. Very interesting to see him versus Joe Biden go after criminal justice reform.
That's going to be quite the stage. Really quickly, before we move on to the next 5, Beto O'Rourke dropping down 1. He also, as I understand it, CNN has learned his team really taking a look at his debate performance last time around, which I'm guessing will influence what we see Wednesday.
Absolutely. I mean, Beto O'Rourke, by any stretch of the imagination, just didn't have a very good debate performance. He was kind of lackluster, boring. Castro really went after him, and that just came on top of the fact that he's just been falling ever since entering the race. He needs a real good debate performance to perhaps reverse that downward momentum.
So moving on to the top 5.
Yeah, moving on to the top 5.
The top 5.
The top 5. So we have at number 5, Pete Buttigieg, who's basically been stable there. Look, if money won nominations, Pete Buttigieg would be well on his way. But he simply put has been falling in the polls, only at about 5% in the national average right now. Can he actually reach out and win some African-American support? Let's see if he uses the debate to do that. At number 4, Bernie Sanders. Look, Bernie Sanders was the second candidate last time around. This time around, he's basically in a 3-way tie for second place with Harris and Warren in the polls, raising a lot of money. But again, he hasn't been able to build on that support despite universal name ID. Number 3, Elizabeth Warren. Very interested to see she and Bernie Sanders on the same debate stage. Are there going to be differences, or are they going to play nice? She's been having some poll momentum going up. Can she sustain that? Kamala Harris, obviously in the last debate, she had a real breakthrough moment. She rose up tremendously in the polls, but we've seen her recede a little bit since that debate. Can she use this debate, again standing next to Joe Biden, to perhaps reestablish that momentum? And of course, finally, Joe Biden. He had such a poor debate last time. Can he get up on that debate stage? Can he be aggressive? We've seen him be more aggressive in recent days on criminal justice reform, on his record with both Harris and Booker. There's going to be a target on his back. Let's see how he acts with that target.
A lot of things to look for. 2 nights to check it out.
2 nights, I love it. And only 191 days till Iowa. I'm counting down each day with a candle on a cake.
I knew you would do that.
That's
Harry
me.
Anton, happy weekend, my
You
friend.
as well.
You enjoy your cake.
I will.
Be sure to watch the debates right here, only on CNN. 2 big nights, as we mentioned. 10 candidates each night. Tuesday, Wednesday. It all kicks off at 8 p.m. live from Detroit. Top of the hour here on CNN. I'm Erica Hill in today for Brooke Baldwin, and we begin with a growing number of Democrats taking a major step toward impeaching the president, pushing ahead with or without full party support. House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler just announcing he is going to court for the secret grand jury material in the Mueller report, and he'll try to enforce a subpoena for former White House counsel Don McGahn, a key witness. Nadler admitting to CNN's Manu Raju there's not much night and day between today's legal action and an actual impeachment inquiry.
Mr. Chairman, but you're saying there's no difference. You're saying there's no difference between what you're doing now and an impeachment inquiry, correct?
In effect, what I'm saying is that we are, well, I suppose there is one difference which you could draw. I mean, if you said that an impeachment inquiry is when you're considering only impeachment, that's not what we're doing. We are investigating all of this, and we are going to see what remedies we could recommend, including the possibility of articles of impeachment. We're not limited to that, but that's very much the possibility as a result of what we're doing.
And while Nadler says he has the support of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she says she's not ready to go down that route just yet.
We will proceed when we have what we need to proceed, not one day sooner. Their advocacy for impeachment only gives me leverage. I have no complaint with what they are doing. I'm willing to take whatever heat there is there to say when The decision will be made in a timely fashion. This isn't endless.
Nadler faces a test of maintaining momentum. Congress leaves for 6 weeks of summer vacation today. Harry Litman is a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, former U.S. Attorney, and he's a political science professor at the University of California, San Diego. Good to have you with us. When we look at what has happened today, and specifically the actions we saw taken by Chairman Nadler, is this the most aggressive step toward impeachment yet? What does it say to you?
Yeah, I think it is the most aggressive step. And we've had Congressman Raskin say that it's already the equivalent of an impeachment inquiry. But Pelosi needs to try to protect the moderate Democrats who don't want to be on record as supporting an impeachment inquiry. So she's endorsing this legal strategy that says, go to the courts, do what you want. It might only be an inch away from an actual impeachment inquiry, but in this way, the Congress as a whole doesn't have to be on record as saying we've adopted an inquiry formally.
So they may not have to be on record, but they are battling time. And in more ways than one, there is this 6 week of summer leave that is coming up for them, obviously starting later today. And what's interesting is that before we heard from both Chairman Nadler and Speaker Pelosi today, we heard from Congresswoman Jackie Speier, who was saying, listen, we basically have until September. And then at that point, we're kind of out of time. A legal route is not necessarily a quick one, Harry.
No, I mean, and that's what the administration has been banking on. It really isn't. And time is their worst enemy. When they come back in September, we're in full bloom of a re-election or an election campaign. And people will be even more distracted than they are now and want to move along. So time is their enemy, and they haven't used it well, and the White House has.
When we look at this, too, there was so much discussion during the Mueller hearing about Watergate and the importance of key witnesses, as we know, which in many ways made that so much more compelling for the American people who were really paying attention there. So just put into context for us, what does Don McGahn mean to all of this?
Don McGahn, in the context of Watergate, means John Dean. He really is the witness of what happened in one of the most important obstruction charges, and he's somebody who could do a lot of damage to the president. Now, when John Dean was subpoenaed, and the records that were subpoenaed, there was immediate compliance in 1974. So much of the time game is to keep McGahn from being there and raising his right hand.
And before we let you go, there's also some talk about the fact that Chairman Nadler could launch impeachment proceedings, but just within his committee. And that even came up earlier today, rather than going through the entire Congress. What do you think the outcome, though, of that would be?
Well, it's sort of a political strategy. It's the same idea where Nadler will be out front, but the moderate Democrats who aren't on the committee don't have to own the action. So I don't think it's any different from a full House doing it. He has authority to do it.
Harry Litman, always appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Speaker Pelosi also apparently clearing the air. Weeks of public feuding with freshman Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The two meeting for a one-on-one conversation today. And Pelosi, when asked about it afterwards, downplaying any need to bury the hatchet.
I don't think there ever was any hatchet. I would never even say that it was a hatchet. But I do think that we sat down today. We had a good meeting, and the Congresswoman is a very gracious member of Congress. I've always felt, again, it's like you're in a family. In a family, you have your differences, but you're still a family.
As for Ocasio-Cortez, she says her goal was to ensure she established open lines of communication with the Speaker's office.
As always, I think the Speaker respects, the fact that we're coming together as a party and that unity, and I'm looking forward to us getting back in September.
Joining me now is Ben Judah, who has a piece in The Atlantic today that zeroes in on the freshman Democrat, her chief of staff. The headline, "The Millennial Left is Tired of Waiting." It is a great read. Ben, good to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So as we look at, let's start with the meeting. So the meeting, seems like progress. We're getting the two of them in a room together to talk about things. But it really is a clash of generations, and that's what you're tackling in this piece. Talk to me about the clash of generations that you see just between the two of them.
Well, I don't share all of the views of the squad and this new generation of millennial Democrats. But what I do share with them is a millennial perspective. And if you are in your early 30s, your worldview is shaped not by a series of Western triumphs, but a series of catastrophic failures, beginning with the Iraq War. Then you have the financial crisis, then you have the failure in 2016 of the liberal establishment to stop Donald Trump. So you're not inclined to defer to the boomer generation of Nancy Pelosi or Steny Hoyer in the House as master experts on strategy.
Because you feel like they've failed you in some way.
In many very significant ways, yes. And if we look at Congress now, Congress is one of the oldest in history.
Mm-hmm.
The age of Congress has been going up dramatically since the Second World War. You have the average age in the Senate is 62. The average age for a congressman is 58. Nancy Pelosi is 79. Steny Hoyer is 80. And as you can hear, I'm a European, I'm from Britain. And Boris Johnson is 55. Emmanuel Macron is 41. The dominant leaders in Italy and in Spain are in their 40s. And it's very clear that the time is fast approaching for generational replacement to take place at the top of the Democratic Party.
It's interesting. In the presser today with Nancy Pelosi, one of the things she talked about was this difference, the differences within her party. So I just want to play a little bit of that for you.
So in our caucus, we have our differences. Respect that instead of making a big issue of it. Respect that. Some personality issues and the rest, they're minor. We have a big schism in our country between what is happening, could happen in this Congress, and what is happening in the White House. Everybody knows we have to keep our eye on the ball.
So what we're hearing from there is respect our differences. She wants the younger generation to respect them, people to respect their differences. Do you think it's the same for the younger lawmakers?
Well, I think in all clashes of generations, both sides see the other as delusional. And the younger Democrats think of themselves as the realists here. They think that the establishment strategy of a pursuit of civility and bipartisanship is just an illusion in the Washington of Donald Trump. And in many ways, they are inspired by history, and they're inspired by the success of the right and by the conservative movement, and how that over the last few decades built up a movement within the country, within the party, and then eventually took over the Republican Party with the aim of forcing through big cultural change and not trying to sort of win the presidency of a weak figure only to lose it a few years later.
It's an interesting parallel that you draw really quickly because we're almost out of time. This really stood out to me. You write, the millennial left in Congress isn't a faction that needs to be slapped down, but a generation that should be engaged with, brought into the fold, and better understood. Do you see that happening, a give and take of ideas between the generations?
I think that can happen, and I think the millennial left have a lot of problematic features, especially in foreign policy, but I think that that's already happening because Nancy Pelosi's strategy of slapping them down has backfired so spectacularly. She's there treating Ocasio-Cortez not quite as an equal, but as somebody very important in the party just today.
Manjuda, great to have you with us. Thank you. Appreciate it. Turning now to the number President Trump is watching closely ahead of the 2020 election. This is not polling. We're talking about productivity here. The gross domestic product report just coming out, and at 2.1%, it shows America's economy continues to expand. However, not at the same rate we've been seeing. The U.S. economy grew at an annual rate of 3.1% in the first quarter. Lynette Lopez is senior finance correspondent for Business Insider. Good to have you with us. So the president, we should point out, tweeting about the GDP, saying, quote, not bad considering we have the very heavy weight of the Federal Reserve anchor wrapped around our neck. Almost no inflation. USA is set to zoom. So I don't know about you, Lynette, but to me, I read that. I think the president is blaming the Fed. Is that what you attribute this slower growth to?
No, you can blame a lot of this slower growth on the president's own trade war and his policies. What we're seeing in this report is that business investment sentiment is way down. So investors are scared because of the trade war, and we're seeing that exports fell 5.6%. We also should note that last year's GDP number, which the president was very excited about, 2.9% for the annual, annually for 2018 was revised down to 2.5%. So now we know we were growing slower than we thought we were growing, and we are continuing to grow more slowly. If the president would stop with all these trade talk, things would be a lot easier. Investors would feel a lot better, and businesses would start investing in the economy again. But this doesn't seem over, and in fact, the president attacked France today. So,
yes, he did. The president also tweeting just a short time ago that the World Trade Organization is, in his words, broken, saying he's directed the U.S. trade representative to, quote, take action because, quote, the world's richest countries claim to be developing countries to avoid WTO rules and get special treatment. Should we read that as being directed largely at China? It seems like it is.
Yeah, I think the president just subtweeted China, and he's complaining because China has acted and appealed to the World Trade Organization as a country that's not as rich and as evolved as it actually is, and that's true. But the Trump administration has done absolutely everything to undermine the WTO itself. Trump doesn't want to work with a rules-based trading order. He wants to work with a trading order that allows the biggest and the strongest countries to do whatever he wants, or to do whatever they want. And so whatever he wants. And that is what we're seeing here, not some kind of defense of the World Trade Order.
I'd also love to get your take on America's most valuable company. So Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin had this to say this week about Amazon and the Justice Department's antitrust review of it and other big tech companies. Take a listen.
I think, as you know, if you look at Amazon, although there's certain benefits to it, they've destroyed the retail industry across the United States. So there's no question they've limited competition. There's areas where they've really hurt small businesses. So I don't think this is a one-size-fits-all. And I don't have an opinion going in other than I think it's absolutely right that the Attorney General is looking into these issues.
What's your take on that, Lynette?
My take on that is that it's true. Amazon has definitely hurt retailers. Amazon has used its own power to block competitors. For example, in 2008, it tried to buy the company that owns diapers.com, soap.com. That company said no, and Amazon used its bots to be able to undercut that competitor in terms of pricing, and eventually undercut them so much that they accepted being bought by Amazon, and then Amazon proceeded to raise prices. So yeah, this is hurting competitors. But I should say that Mnuchin is not telling the entire story. His friends on Wall Street and private equity have done quite a great deal of damage to retail as well by buying retailers essentially for their real estate and then gutting those companies. So there's more than one reason why retail is suffering in this country. Amazon certainly has a lot of the blame to take for that, and we have legislation that can combat that. You know, we used to enforce the Robinson-Patson Act from 1936, which basically outlawed predatory pricing. So that whole story that I told you would not be allowed. And if we want to return to a level playing field in terms of preserving markets themselves and not just worrying about prices at the end of the day, that'll create more value for consumers, and we won't have companies like Amazon gobbling up share the way that they have.
Lynette Lopez, really appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem.
Two of the top-tier candidates in 2020 rolling out their economic plans with just a few days to go until the next big debate. Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg also making headlines talking about racial divisions in this country today. Plus, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell blocking an election security bill despite a report from his colleague. 4 days and counting until the next round of debates right here on CNN. And all weekend long, the candidates will be crisscrossing the country, honing in on their messages, rolling out new policies. Mayor Buttigieg unveiling his new economic plan today. The plan is pro-union, allowing all workers the right to join a labor union. He also calls for legislation to make pay gaps public and renews his call for a federal minimum wage of at least $15 an hour. Today, in front of the majority black audience at the National Urban League's annual conference, Buttigieg also went after President Trump.
My generation saw this country elect its first black president and then turn around and elect a racist to the White House. And we ought to call that what it is.
CNN senior national correspondent Kyung La is in Indianapolis, where Senator Kamala Harris spoke to the same audience to roll out some of her economic plans, and she joins us now. Kyung, good to see you. So what more did we hear from the candidates today?
Well, from Kamala Harris specifically, you heard a similar anti-Trump sentiment, and then she did unveil two planks of what her campaign is calling part of her black policy agenda, her black agenda. And those two planks being an investment, a $60 billion investment aimed at STEM investments, so the science, technology, engineering, math, at historically black colleges and universities. $60 billion there. That's one proposal. The second proposal, $12 billion at boosting black entrepreneurship in this country, helping them sort of get started, startup money, if you will. So after she talked about that in her prepared remarks, then she took questions. And the first question she took was about her career as a prosecutor. And the question was whether she could advocate for criminal justice reform, given the fact that she worked on the inside. Here's what she said.
Why do we only have to be on the outside? On bended knee or trying to break down the door? Shouldn't we also have a role on the inside where the decisions are being made in a way we can influence the change that must occur? And I'm very proud of the fact that it was because I was the first black woman elected DA in a state of 40 million people that I had the power to create one of the first reentry initiatives in the United States focused on young drug sales offenders, young adults, and getting them jobs and counseling and support in raising their families, so that they could re-enter the community in a way they wouldn't re-offend. I didn't have to ask anybody permission to do it because I was running the office.
We have heard Harris make this similar robust defense of her record before on the campaign trail. And this is something, Erica, that has followed her throughout these many months on the trail. And it is likely to come up again, especially in communities of color. Erica?
Kyung La with the latest for us from Indianapolis. Kyung, thank you. Healthcare, another top issue, of course, among voters, and there are really clear divisions among Democrats as they prepare for the CNN debates. Dr. Sanjay Gupta now breaks down what all of this means for you.
They have different ideas on how to get there, but the same central message.
Healthcare is a human right.
Access to healthcare should be a right.
It's time for this country to make quality, affordable health care a right and not a privilege.
Better, cheaper health care. It's a challenge no matter where you are on the political spectrum.
I think people are really frustrated with the current healthcare system.
Erin Fusey-Brown, a health law expert at Georgia State, says the system has fundamental flaws.
It's really the worst consumer experience.
And we pay a lot for it. The United States has the most expensive health care in the world, around $3.5 trillion a year.
People should not be forced into financial ruin, into bankruptcy. For what reason? Because someone in the family became ill.
In 2016, his was a lone voice. But many Democrats are now getting in line behind Bernie Sanders, who has long called for a single-payer system.
I'm with Bernie on Medicare for all.
So then how does this plan differ from what Senator Sanders is proposing?
I think that they're very similar.
In a single-payer system, everyone would be automatically enrolled in a government-run health care program like Medicare.
It would cover doctor's visits, hospitalizations, but also hearing aids, dental, and vision, these candidates say. There'd be some copays for brand-name prescription drugs. But a sort of litmus test is starting to take shape. Question is, will a single-payer system also eliminate private insurance as we know it?
Who here would abolish their private health insurance in favor of a government-run plan?
At the Democratic debates in June, only Senator Sanders and Harris, along with Warren and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, raised their hands. Harris later said she had misinterpreted the question.
Anyone who has their employer-based insurance can keep it if they want.
The former Vice President, Joe Biden, doesn't envision a system without private insurance, and he is leading the charge on the public option. Perhaps no surprise, Biden wants to expand Obamacare.
In a public option, everyone would have the option to buy a Medicare type of plan for themselves, but they wouldn't be automatically enrolled.
We can protect and build on Obamacare and make sure that at least 97% to 100% of American people have coverage.
Biden's plan caps premiums and offers subsidies to buy insurance regardless of your income. Biden says his proposal would cost $750 billion over 10 years, money he would raise primarily through taxes and cutting costs. Sanders' plan calls for tax increases as well, money that he believes will be more than offset by lower premiums.
My guess is that people in the middle class will be paying somewhat more in taxes, but they're going to be paying significantly less overall in health care.
Harris says she believes her plan could be achieved without a middle-class tax increase.
Senator Sanders
part
is
of it is going to have to be about Wall Street paying more. It's going to have to be about looking at how we and what we tax.
But Medicare for All may not be an easy sell politically. A recently released NPR-PBS Marist National poll found 70% favor Medicare for All for those who want it. But just 4 in 10 say Medicare for All is a good idea if there is no longer private insurance. And 54% are even more blunt, saying it's a bad idea. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, CNN, reporting.
And you can bet health care will come up again at the CNN Democratic debates. 10 candidates each night facing off, Tuesday and Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on CNN, live from Detroit. Up next, Senate Republicans blocking efforts to protect the security of U.S. elections. And now a member of the House Intel Committee says she is starting to think President Trump wants Russian interference in the next election. You could call this the other long-awaited government report on Russian interference in the 2016 election. After 2 years, the Senate Intelligence Committee just releasing the first of 5 reports on the matter. And like the Mueller report, it is heavily redacted. Like Mueller himself at his hearing this week, it is also sending a stark call out about stopping future election interference. This report, however, does offer some new details. In 2016, it finds all 50 states were targeted. All 50 states. And then there's this also in the report. Quote, Russian cyber actors were in a position to delete or change voter data. Let that sink in for a minute. They were in the position to delete or change voter data. We should point out, they go on to say the committee is not aware of any evidence that they did so. But just that moment, it would make you think. Well, the bipartisan report also comes as the Senate Majority Leader blocked votes on election security legislation.
It's just a highly partisan bill from the same folks who spent 2 years hyping up a conspiracy theory about President Trump and Russia.
CNN political commentator Peter Beinart is contributing editor of The Atlantic. It was shocking, honestly, to hear Mitch McConnell say that just on the heels of Robert Mueller, who very clearly in his testimony on Wednesday was doing his best to drive home the real threat of Russian election interference. Where do you think this is coming from with Mitch McConnell?
I just think it's absolutely unforgivable. I mean, there is a desire to see this in partisan terms because the perception was that the Russians wanted Donald Trump to win last time. But our democracy is at stake. I mean, they just passed this massive defense budget, billions and billions of dollars, right? And yet they're willing to leave us basically wide open because Mueller said the Russians are doing this now. Other countries will do it as well when they realize. And can think about the consequences if it turned out there were millions of votes missing from an election that just were not in the system or seemed that they'd returned, right? Our democracy, look, remember what happened in 2000, right? Our democracy would be thrown into chaos. And yet the House bill is just calling for giving the states more money so that they can basically secure their systems and requiring paper receipts so there's a way of tracking what happened. And McConnell is not allowing a vote on it. I mean, it boggles the mind.
Well, it's also interesting. So Congresswoman Jackie Speer, who serves on House Intel, had this to say.
I'm beginning to think that there is an interest by some within the administration, starting at the very top, to allow the Russians to continue to intervene because it worked out very well for them in 2016.
What evidence do you have for that charge?
I'm basing it just on the fact they have not indicated any interest in really delving down into this election security issue. There are many hackers that have been able to hack into election machines across this country at DEF CON, which takes place in Las Vegas every year. The president has never uttered a word. He still says it's a Russian hoax.
You know, as Jake asked her, what's your evidence for that? Because that's a pretty bold claim. What do you make of that?
Look, I don't think unless you have evidence, you can make these claims. What I've seen from the reporting that's been done is that it's not quite as bad, but it's almost as bad, which is that Trump is such a narcissist. His ego is so frail that people in the White House will not even bring up the subject with him. This is what the New York Times has, or others have reported, the subject of how to harden our election systems, because he can only see it as a threat to his own legitimacy. He can't distinguish between the idea that some people are questioning him and the fact that we as a country have to be safe, and that's why there's this opposition to doing anything about it. That's what I think the reporting that I've seen has suggested.
Also, really quickly, take a step back with me for a minute, if you will. If we look at the last several days, so we have this very clear warning from Robert Mueller, also, from Senate Intel. As we're looking at all of this over the last week, Russia's probably watching this and going, well, this is an interesting thing to watch, right? Especially the warning that they're still getting involved in our elections for 2020. You've got Iran going after tankers, firing missiles. You've got North Korea firing missiles. And yet, the U.S. isn't really addressing much of that at all. What is it doing for us on a world stage?
I mean, part of the problem, I think, right now is that we are so addled as a nation by the unprecedented kind of nature of this presidency that there's very little attention span. I mean, it's hard to really get people to focus attention on these things. I mean, Trump, thank goodness, seems to have pulled back from the brink with Iran, but we have people like National Security Advisor John Bolton who have said very explicitly that they support war with Iran, and things could easily spiral out of control. It's a very, very dangerous situation, and you can't have a lot of confidence in the man at the top.
Peter Beinart, good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next.